On the front lawn of the West Shore Unitarian Universalist Church in Cleveland, Ohio, the 21 gunshots rang out with great clarity and force. They marked the too soon death of Lieutenant Colonel Mark Matsushima, who was always known as Cousin Mark to differentiate him from my father, who bore the same first name. The names and faces of the young soldiers were before me as I stood there in my stole, having just officiated my cousin's service. The young soldiers were a mix of many races, and yet each had the same regulation-issued passivity. As we stood there at the close of the service I had just held, stood there next to my uncle and my aunt, I felt as if I was holding a complexity with which my liberal upbringing had left me unprepared. Just a few years before, I had offered a prayer in the service for my uncle, a man who had been actually a war hero and who was written about in The Coldest Winter, David Hammersham's book about the Korean War. This man who had worked so hard, perhaps in part, to restore the honor that had been taken from his family during the internment of his teenage years as a Japanese American, was never hailed for this heroic act within my home growing up. My parents were Oberlin College liberals, and in the Vietnam era, we lived in Amherst, Massachusetts, where hippie resistance was the thing. Though my parents were not actually particularly politically active, patriotism and nationalism were seen as the same, and I was taught to be a little afraid of holidays such as Memorial Day, a little afraid of those days when we fly the flag, because that, for my family, was a sign of another kind of victim of these kinds of wars. In my childhood, we sang songs about peace, and we made cardboard peace signs, not quite as beautiful as Marge's, but cardboard peace signs wrapped in yarn, and we felt as if the days in which war would be the solution would be rapidly drawing to a close. That we can, and that we must, hold the complexity and our complicity in the continuance and continued use of war as a means to resolve the complex issues of our world is clear to me on this particular Memorial Day. That we must also hold close the experience of those who have been caught in this experience is also evident. In our tradition, we have had an uneasy and unresolved relationship with war-making and peacemaking as Unitarian Universalists. This particular congregation has had an important history in incubating and launching the Mount Diablo Peace and Justice Center, fueled by the passionate dedication, commitment, conviction, and courage of Andy Balso. This place is as close to a UU Peace Church as you can get, and many others, including Daniel Zwickel and Bob Hansen, and so many more, have dedicated so many hours of their life to witnessing to the possibility of peace. And yet, our Unitarian Universalist Association as a whole has never taken an official stance as a peace church the way that, for example, the Quakers have. The Battle Hymn of the Republic was written by Julia Ward Howe, the same Unitarian firebrand who brought us a Mother's Day of Peace. While the song was actually an abolitionist anthem, predicting the victory of the Union forces over the evils of slaveholders, its lyrics clearly provide support for the use of might in the service of the right. And that has often been our position. A noted hawk, President William Taft, is counted among our Unitarian ranks, and so is John Haynes Holmes, who left our association because of his principled pacifist stance around the same time. Our history is, in a way, suspended between both of these poles. We have a faith that sees war not only as a desirable show of strength when confronted with evil doings, but also as a needed option to have when words fail. That we need to know how to hold the consequences of our societal insistence on war and violence in all of its forms also seems critical to me, particularly today. In that vein, I want to take a moment to invite all of the veterans among us to rise in body or spirit so that we might take a moment in silent tribute to recognize you. Thank you for your service and your dedication. Words do fail to comprehend your experiences, and yet we honor you. We cannot afford to avoid this Memorial Day observance, for the truth is we have been quietly turning to the options of violence with increasing frequency in our society, and there may be more before us. When our words fail because we do not look at what is before us, then we are quiet collaborators with the continued use of force. How do we deny the realities of those harmed because we do not want to embrace that those sorts of harm exist? How many of us squirm to hear the details of that very real account that Jim just shared with us? How many of us think on any regular basis about the many, many, many young veterans who are coming home back into our midst after serving the many, many armed conflicts our nation is involved in still yet today? A disproportionate share of them are low-income people of color or those who have had issues and traumas in their young years which cause them to take an atypical path into life. And while campus protests still garner news footage, this can give us a skewed attitude about war because according to research from the Pew Foundation, here is a quote, "There is a generation gap over U.S. military interventions. It is older Americans, not young people, who typically show the greatest wariness about using military force." This was evident, they write, during the war in Vietnam, and it remains the case today. Pew surveys now show that roughly half of those in every age group, except for the age group of 50 to 64, my idealistic generation, believe that the decision to go to war in Iraq was right. And until recently, senior citizens were the least enthusiastic. Last fall, for example, just 39% of those 65 and older felt it was right to go to war, while 50% said it was wrong. So just in terms of the numbers, how often do we take the time to remember that the U.S. Veterans Administration reports that there are still 16 million veterans in the year 2017. 45% of them today are Gulf War veterans. And yet we rarely hear or think of, comprehend, or take in the complex realities of our millennial veterans. How much of this is due to the fact that some of us thought that we could stop thinking about or looking at war because it was something outdated and outmoded that we would outgrow? We may all hate the use of force. We may not wish it to be done in our name, and yet if it is nonetheless happening, how does it help to look away and not acknowledge it? Just like the Vietnam veterans, millennials who come home are not heralded or even noticed. This is another failure of our words and of our moral courage. Throughout our lives, in this imperfect world, we will be confronted with circumstances not of our making or of our choosing, and yet not acknowledging them and not addressing them can make the pain for those most affected that much more. Courage, conviction, and commitment are what people on both sides of the discussions and debates about the use of force have had to have. Courage, commitment, and conviction are what people going through many other forms of violence in our society have to exercise to get themselves up and keep going one day at a time. It is important that we learn the skills to hold the complexity of these realities, not just our ideals, as we did when I was a child in Amherst, singing songs about peace and holding our little yarn creations, but truly looking at the realities of our world. I want to tell you, in the interest of truth, that this picture on the cover is not me. I understand that some people have come to that conclusion. This picture on the cover, I'm very honored by that, the little girl in the front. But the picture on the cover is here because it honors one of our many Unitarian Universalist military chaplains. One of my Meadville Lombard Theological School classmates was the founder and first member of the UU Military Chaplains Group, which has now grown significantly in its ranks. A portrait of Chaps Kane, as Cynthia Kane is more commonly known, is also hanging in our Unitarian Universalist Association offices, and it shows the many nuances of what it means to recognize that those who are most affected by our inability to solve larger issues through negotiation and goodwill. Chaps Kane is a pacifist and a Unitarian Universalist humanist who has found that her ministry provides an important outlet to those who are serving who are agnostic or non-affiliated. The work that she does to minister to those most affected by our inability to find peaceful means for resolving conflicts has caused her to win major awards around the country, including one from Harvard Divinity School, from which she graduated. And at that time, that occasion of receiving that award, she passed on the words of the commanding general in her first unit. She said, "He told me, Chaps, my job is to kill people," Kane remembers. "He told me, your job is to keep me from liking it." Keeping people of goodwill involved in the conversations about our use of force in our nation and never letting an opportunity pass to recognize its true costs is how we continue to allow those uses to be tempered. Kane, whose chaplaincy assignments included Arlington National Cemetery, Guantanamo Bay, 2 Navy aircraft carriers, 2 Marine units, and the Coast Guard, sees her work as carrying the words that others have failed to carry. She says, "I've heard many war stories about service members' experiences in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea, even World War II," she says. "There's a necessity in being able to share these stories and have them heard. I am learning here, serving and wrestling with tough life and death questions in the same way that the people that I minister to are." She does not shy away from making people embrace the complexity of her identity, saying, "I am here being exactly who I am. I'm a God-loving Unitarian Universalist, a disciplined and logistically minded naval officer, a peace-oriented, conscientious objecting pacifist, and a yoga-practicing, zazen meditating, tree-hugging, Prius-driving spouse and partner. I am a part of things, and the people that I work with and for are a part of me." We must, though we are the ones that hold the vision of a more perfect world, be willing to live in the world fully in which we are a part. We must be able to be present to those who face the challenges and face what is challenging for them with them. In my 20s, I worked with a personable young man, a few years younger than me, who was also a veteran of the First Gulf War, where he had the unfortunate luck of being placed directly in the path of a lot of chemical weapons. Looking back on it now, I wonder how the course of his life has gone. I wonder if we were truly understanding about his absenteeism, about his trouble concentrating, about the difficulties he had doing his work day to day, whether we really understood the unbearable and excruciating physical agony that he was in but rarely spoke of. I don't think we were uncaring to him as colleagues, But when I look back on it now, I wonder if we were truly able to be present to even a fraction of what he had gone through, and in that way, offer him what he needed in these first months of his re-entry. Our faith is focused on this world, and as such, we strive for its betterment, even on the days when that feels sort of absurd. We must keep before us always the goal of working towards that world of my childhood naivete, which says that peace is the answer, and we must work against all forms of violence. And yet, until we get to that point, we must also recommit ourselves, I believe, to the care of those who have been exposed to the greatest traumas of violence. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to Jim Hassey for being willing to give us such a skilled look of what it means to be confronted with the realities of war, whether or not that would be your choice. Thank you, Jim. We may not choose war, many of us would not, and yet we cannot simply avoid its realities by not looking at its victims. We may not choose to have our children more skilled at intruder drills than they are at civics, and yet we cannot avoid that reality. We may not choose to know or acknowledge that violence exists within our society and within our homes, and yet when we are confronted with that reality, we cannot turn away or deny the truth of its victims either. We are the people of this very flawed and imperfect world. We are the people that embrace its possibilities, and we must also embrace its realities. For those who have faced or carry the traumatic scars of violence, we must remember that they are here, part of our communities, and we must know within ourselves the courage, the commitment, and the conviction to hold their stories. Our Universalist ancestors asked us to do nothing less than to create heaven on this earth, to create, in other words, the conditions in which all can live in health and safety and in the fullness of who they know themselves to be. To change the world, we must acknowledge the realities of what needs to be changed. To work towards a world of nonviolence and peace, we must embrace the true costs of war and violence in its many forms and honor those who have borne them. This Memorial Day, may we do so, and at the same time keep committing ourselves to work towards peace on this earth, to find better words and better ways so that no one might have to know the scourge of violence, and that those who have been touched by its reality will know our love and our care. In this way, may that which we dream of become a little bit more real in our lifetime. And may that be our observance on this Memorial Day weekend.